Winding back the clock several centuries to the diaspora, there was Tinia, a Ventrue Methuselah supposedly embraced by the antediluvian himself. The story goes that she journeyed to Italy and with 13 other vampires came to rule over the Etruscans, an Italic people that inhabited the region that roughly corresponds to modern Tuscany. Like most vampires at the time, Tinia and her compatriots ruled over them as gods. In fact, Tinia herself shares a name with the Etruscan sky god, although whether she lent her name to this deity or adopted it like Artemis or Thea did in Sparta is unknown. Not much is known about her except that she had a thirst for discovery and knowledge, eventually got so old in vampiric terms that she became spiritually and creatively burnt out, losing the ability to innovate, and that she was overthrown by one of her childer, a fellow by the name of Kolat. Kolat was young and ambitious, and unlike his sire and her fellows who favored the Etruscans, he had a special fondness for a small city in the south called Rome. Some credit Kolat as the inspiration behind Rome's decision to rebel and ultimately overthrow its Etruscan overlords. Other sources say that he merely took advantage of it. Either way, he became top undead dog in the Eternal City and effectively became the Prince of Rome, though it is debatable whether that position really existed back then. His tenure oversaw the transition of Rome from small city-state to burgeoning empire, and from its earlier kingdom to a republic. However, Kolat is important mostly because his style of rule was different than that of any Ventrue before him. He was one of, if not the very first of his clan, to adopt the policy of indirect rule of humanity from the shadows. His sire, Tinia, and even Artemis or Thea over in Sparta had ruled their respective humans openly as god-kings in the old mold, although in the case of Artemis, it was done with a very light touch in order to avoid provoking a rebellion among the kine. She had influenced Spartan decision-making, but had never really commanded obedience. And as the Greco-Persian Wars demonstrated, the Spartans could ignore her advice and decide what to do for themselves. It was Kolat that in many ways anticipated the way that the Camarilla would seek to rule humanity in the modern Knights. Kolat's great skill was in collecting favors and peddling influence. Roman families built their power on a series of patron-client relationships, a kind of quid pro quo. The Roman elite were clients to the plebeians, Kolat was client to the Roman elites. And so, via this tangled network of favors and clientelism, Kolat effectively puppeteered the Roman Senate, and thus the Republic as a whole, nurturing it through its period of expansion. It was during this time that many Greek Ventrue, such as Artemis or Thea and her child Lysander, emigrated from Greece to southern Italy, a region called Magna Graecia because it had been long settled by Greek colonists. Artemis made Syracuse in Sicily her new home before eventually falling into torpor, while Lysander set up shop in Tarentum, modern-day Taranto, in the arch of the Italian boot. Inevitably, the two civilizations came into violent conflict, and though both sides had vampires working with them, the Romans were just better at fighting. And so, in desperation, the Magna Grecians reached out to the old homeland for help. Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, answered the call, mostly because it gave him a great excuse to go conquering. He did win several battlefield victories against the Romans, but the casualties of those victories were so high that his name would become immortalized in the phrase Pyrrhic victory. In the end, Rome triumphed, and Magna Graecia submitted to Roman rule. It was in one of the final battles of the conflict known as the Pyrrhic War that Lysander, who had been fighting alongside the Tarentines, was made prisoner by one of Kolat's childer, a curious and ambitious young Ventrue named Titus Venturus Camillus, Camilla for short. Evidently, Camilla was a big believer in being civil to prisoners of war, for he treated his captive with courtesy and often engaged in conversation with him. And so, from Lysander, Camilla learned a great deal about the world beyond the tiny, tiny Italian peninsula. Lysander told him of what the Greeks had achieved and what Clan Ventrue had achieved, how Artemis or Thea had reigned over Sparta and, by extension, the Peloponnesian League. Camilla, who had only ever known his sire's way of doing things, was shocked and intrigued by the idea of Artemis Orthia ruling openly as a goddess over Sparta. And so, the more he talked with Lysander, the more the germ of an idea began to grow in his mind. When the Pyrrhic War concluded, Camilla returned to Rome with Lysander at his side. He confronted Colot and told him that he had a new vision for how the Roman Ventrue should rule. Supposedly, Colot saw the wisdom of Camilla's vision and willingly stepped down from power. More likely, Camilla overpowered and diablerized his sire with Lysander's help. For the most part, Camilla's style of rule as Prince of Rome resembled that of his sire. He would not command the Romans or let his vampiric nature be known to them, the Romans being a very superstitious and hostile people. Also, like Colot, his power was built on collecting favors and establishing patronage for several prominent patrician families. The main difference was that Camilla would work far more directly with the Roman elite to guide and influence their policies, mostly by using ghouls as proxies and messengers. The Roman Senate had never really been aware of Colot's existence as he'd manipulated them during his tenure. Now, many of them knew that there was some ultimate power broker in the shadows of Roman society. But, to his credit, Camilla also understood that the best way to lead people was to let them think that your idea was really theirs. For example, Camilla would point out to his clients how important it was to ensure that trade flowed smoothly, or that the legions could go from one province to another as quickly as possible. And so the Romans figured, let's build and maintain some roads. Camilla would point out how useful it would be if Rome had more reliable sources of clean drinking water, and so the senators would commission aqueducts. Camilla's example is one that many Ventrue sires in the modern Knights try to impress upon the younger members of the clan. A truly effective Ventrue does not hoard power, though the other clans might foolishly think otherwise. He knows how to delegate, how to share power, judiciously, carefully, but share it nonetheless. Be the big idea man, let your proxies sweat the details. Of course, when the Romans carried out these plans, Rome benefited. They received glory and kudos for their achievement, and of course, made sure to repay the favors owed to their mysterious, shadowy benefactor. And so Camilla grew rich and powerful, but he remained a vampire with very narrow horizons. As long as prosperity improved in Italy, he really didn't have any interest in what lay beyond. If the Romans wanted to conquer new lands, he wasn't going to stop them, but nor was he going to directly encourage them either. Granted, the Romans never really needed any encouragement to expand their territory. By contrast, Lysander was very concerned with what lay beyond the borders of Italy. He would often secretly travel the Mediterranean, acting as Camilla's eyes and ears, and it wasn't long before he discovered Carthage and its Brujah masters. Ever since his embrace by Artemis Orthia, Lysander had possessed a deep hatred for the Brujah, who had backed Athens, the enemy of his original homeland of Sparta. The Brujah had slipped through the Ventrue clan's fingers after the Peloponnesian War. This time, Lysander was determined that this rival of his clan be humbled properly. He didn't really need much of an excuse to begin calling for Carthage's destruction, though the horror stories attributed to its vampiric rulers certainly gave him more justification. But Camilla remained singularly uninterested in the matter. And then, in 265, Carthage decided to muscle in on a dispute between two Greek cities in Sicily, Syracuse and Messina, which I got mixed up with Messenia in the previous chapter. Syracuse, if you recall, was Artemis Orthia's new home, though by this point she had slipped into torpor. The new vampiric ruler of the city was a Malkavian named Alcaeus. When an envoy of the Brujah told him that Carthage had plans for Sicily and that he'd better not stand in their way, the Malkavian, mentally unstable like most of his clan, flew into a rage and decapitated the envoy on the spot. Realizing that he had just put himself into some serious hot water, Alcaeus revived the sleeping Artemis Orthia and another prominent vampire in Syracuse, Arakel, the purported antediluvian founder of Clan Toreador. Between the three of them, they managed to influence the leaders of Syracuse into preparing for war with Carthage, while at the same time finally managing to persuade Camilla to enter the war on their side. So commenced the Three Punic Wars, at least that's what the mortals called it. To the Ventrue, it was only 3 phases of a single conflict, the Second Brujah War. In the First Punic War, there was a lot of fighting between both the mortals and the undead, but the war was mostly ended by the humans, with Rome coming out on top and claiming overlordship over the former Carthaginian possessions of Sicily and Sardinia. After Carthage's capitulation, Lysander was all for going in and dealing the killing blow to the Brujah. But thanks to the failures of several Roman and Ventrue incursions into Africa during the war, Camilla remained reluctant to involve himself in anything beyond the shores of Italy. When Hannibal Barca kicked off the Second Punic War and invaded Italy via the Alps, there was actually little to no vampiric involvement. Those aligned with the Romans were stunned into fearful silence by Hannibal's audacity and his many crushing victories in the field, while the Brujah were happy to sit back and let the Carthaginian general do the fighting for them. Once again, though, Rome won. Once again, Carthage capitulated, and once again, Lysander, this time backed by Alcaeus and Artemis Orthia, insisted that Camilla should take the fight to the enemy, and again, Camilla refused. But this time, Lysander was not about to be denied, and he continued to pester Camilla on the idea of finally destroying Carthage and the Brujah that infested it. On the mortal side of things, this was around the same time that the famous statesman Cato the Elder began ending each of his speeches with the famous phrase, "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. It's never mentioned as such, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if Cato the Elder was perhaps a ghoul of Lysander's. And so at last, the many voices clamoring for action wore down Camilla's resistance, and he gave his consent to instigating a war with Carthage. For the Romans, the Third Punic War was little more than a formality, a quick siege and a lengthy sacking of the city. For the vampires, it was one of the most savage fights in all of antiquity. Dozens tasted final death that night. Among those were Tiberius Carnifex, a powerful and prominent child of Camilla, and Artemis Orthia herself, the founding mother of the clan. Alcaeus, the Malkavian prince whose actions helped precipitate the Brujah War, was badly injured and slipped into torpor soon afterward. Lysander lived, though with many new scars. By his order was Carthage razed to the ground and the very earth salted to ensure that nothing would grow and that any Cainites that had escaped the Ventrue wrath by going into torpor beneath the earth would never arise. From then on, it was nothing but uninterrupted success for Rome, conquest piled upon conquest. Spain, North Africa, Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and Clan Ventrue, headed by Camilla, grew fat and prosperous indeed. However, all that conquering meant that now the Roman Empire included a lot of vampires that were not Ventrue. And so, in a way, Camilla and the Roman Ventrue found themselves in a similar position to that of the Ventrue antediluvian and his childer in the Second City, ruling over an unruly and motley collection of vampires of all shapes and sizes. It was then that Camilla did the most important thing for the legacy of Clan Ventrue in its entire history. Up until this point, like every other vampire from every other clan, each Ventrue had essentially ruled his or her patch of territory, a law unto himself or herself. It was Camilla who insisted for the first time that if the clan wished to hold on to its position of preeminence among the undead, they needed to organize. Power and authority needed to be centralized. As the Roman Republic failed and transitioned into the Empire, Camilla took his cues from several prominent mortals of the time: Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and most important of all, the man who one day became Augustus, first Emperor of Rome. Obviously, unlike Augustus, Camilla could not attain the kind of absolute power that the mortal ruler did, but that was not really his plan. What he did do was establish a system by which more powerful and senior members of Clan Ventrue were given autonomy in local affairs in the provinces. mostly adjudicating disputes between younger and more junior members. Naturally, Camilla assumed the position of top dog within the entire clan, the supreme arbiter of disputes across the empire, but like with the mortals of Rome, he knew to reign with a light hand. Vampires, and especially Ventrue vampires, are after all a bit more powerful and dangerous than mortal senators. It doesn't do to push too far with them. Regardless, it was by establishing this hierarchy across the empire that Camilla essentially made Clan Ventrue what it was. And well into the modern nights, although obviously younger members of the clan chafe against it, most Ventrue concede that it is this organization that is the reason why the clan is as successful as it is, and why they are so determined to maintain it. If we return to the global structure of Clan Ventrue in the modern Knights, below the Ephorate and the Strategoi that are the legacy of Sparta, from Rome come the positions of lictors and tribunes. If the Ephorate is the Ventrue equivalent of the Camarilla's inner circle and the Strategoi the equivalent of Justicars, lictors are essentially the equivalent of archons. Named after the bodyguards that protected high-ranking Romans, lictors are known as troubleshooters in the modern Knights. And, much like the archons do for Camarilla Justicars, lictors serve as the direct agents of individual strategos within Clan Ventrue. After all, no vampire, no matter how powerful, can be everywhere at once. By delegating more minor tasks to lictors, the strategos is able to focus on bigger issues within the clan. If the Ephorate and Strategoi serve as the brains of the clan's global leadership, and the lictors are the muscle, the tribunes are the eyes and ears. Sometimes called agents at large in the modern Knights, their job is essentially to keep an eye on things, and if necessary, report difficult matters to higher authorities. They also serve as a direct line of communication between the Ephorate and local Ventrue leadership. Speaking of local leadership, between the Spartan-inspired ranks of the Gerusia and the Aren lie three Roman-inspired ranks: praetors, aediles, and quaestors. Alternately known as managers, supervisors, and foremen, respectively, the higher up the ranks you are, the broader your responsibilities. Praetors, for example, mostly comprise the local Gerusia and deal with broad issues concerning the local Ventrue community. The aediles concern themselves with specific areas of interest to the clan, while the quaestors handle disputes and issues concerning individual clan members. But apart from the fact that you have to be an elder to be a praetor, how exactly does one rise the ranks within Clan Ventrue, locally or globally? Which brings us to perhaps the most important legacy of Rome upon the clan, the concept of dignitas. Dignitas is difficult to summarize. It's an intangible thing that can't be quantified. It encompasses not just a Ventrue's dignity, but also the sum of his accomplishments, his status in society, and the measure of what the Ventrue anyway consider to be honor. It is the sum of a Ventrue's worth as an individual. Dignitas can be increased by winning conflicts, making alliances, and by holding offices within the clan. But it can also be lost through failure, through insult, and defeat. To a Ventrue, dignitas is the second most precious thing in their whole undead existence. The most precious obviously being the blood they need to survive, and even then some Ventrue would likely debate you on that. It is by increasing one's dignitas that a Ventrue climbs the ranks, both within local communities and within the overall leadership of the clan. And if you make the mistake of impugning a Ventrue's dignitas or diminishing it in any way, rightly or wrongly, deliberately or by accident, then you have made an enemy for eternity. Ventrue have waged feuds lasting centuries, all because of a perceived slight. That is the supreme importance of dignitas. It's no wonder, therefore, that Rome is really where the Ventrue truly came into their own, and why so many elders look back on it as a golden age. But of course, like all golden ages, it was never destined to last.